Hi, my name is Reinhardt, one of the DCA of NOVED 2023, and today in this video, I'm gonna explain and discuss about the exhibition round result of NOVED 2023. There are four things we're gonna discuss. Firstly, the general overview. Secondly, the decision and the scores. Thirdly, the comparison between teams. And fourthly, the justification for scores that will be explained in the next section of this video that will be delivered by Ka Ariel. The general overview of the debate. So, in the exhibition, we were debating under the motion this House opposes the glorification of career success. And the overall judgment is the debate was very, very tight. There was a small margins for some comparison between teams, and we think the reason for this is there's a lack of explicit weighing of each team's identity, and therefore it leads to many judges interpret the clash in a different way that results into a different decisions as well. Um, Eventually, the CAP came into different initial calls before actually reaching the consensus of the decisions that we're gonna announce shortly. The decision. So the ranking are as follows. The first goes to the opening government with the score of 77 and 79. The second goes to the closing opposition with the score of 75 and 80. The third goes to the closing government with the score of 78 and 72. And the fourth goes to the opening opposition with the score of 67 and 77. The comparison between teams will be done in a chronological order. So first, let's talk about the opening government's case. Opening government essentially brought three things. First, that the glorification leads to people being pressured since it will be used to judge someone else's life. And the outcome of that is that it leads to pressure, invalidation, demonization, and discrimination, especially for those people who are unable to access the success standard. The second thing that opening government brought is that the ability of achieving career success is inaccessible due to the privilege necessary to succeed and that the money is designed to be limited. The example given for the privilege are education and resource and so on and so forth. The third thing that the opening government brought is that ideally people should have the agency to do whichever job that you want, and this can only happen if the narrative is opposed and you are not dependent on what the society tells you. Opening opposition brought two things on the table. One, that the definition of success in the narrative is diverse, and therefore the harm is that in the opening government does not manifest. They told you that success can be determined according to the job, field, and capability of each individuals, such as being an artist, authors, news anchor, and so on and so forth. And the second thing that they brought is that the glorification of the narrative is necessary because that people needs the push to pursue their career goals and not give up in the process. And secondly, that the glorification of the narrative is the prerequisite for the provision of facilities, assistance, government budget, and charity. This is how we weighed the opening exchange. We think opening government wins against the opening opposition because of two reasons. One, because of their magnitude of impact. OG has successfully proven how the invalidation will impact most people, especially when the standardized career success is not accessible. Therefore, the majority of the society, in result to the glorification, will be mostly unhappy and invalidated. Opening up opposition's argument on the diversification of success is still contingent on the financial success, given the example of news anchor getting house and Kuningan, and therefore the likelihood of success being diverse and accessible has been mitigated by the opening government as well, due to their analysis on privilege and limited money supply, and therefore proves that these are still inaccessible, irrespective of the diversification of the job types, because the structural reason that the opening government brought is not about the job type, but rather the how the world is constructed by the privilege and money supply in itself. Therefore, irrespective of opening opposition mitigation is insufficient to tackle the opening government's case. Opening opposition at best mitigated a tiny case where some people may be able to succeed, but since the majority of the society is still harmfully impacted by the narrative as what the opening government says, opening government proves a more exclusive impact. The second thing, the second reason as to why opening government win is because of the certainty of the benefit. Opening opposition's benefit of having people and government support you in the process is reliant on the likelihood of people being supportive, and we think that the likelihood was rather under elaborated in the opening oppositions. Opening government says that the narrative creates a standard that will result in pressure, and we think that this is more likely as that's the pressure that becomes the opening opposition prerequisite to the benefit of ensuring people are pushed to succeed, and therefore we can believe the opening government's pressure and standard. And therefore, we believe also that the opening government's argument of agency to pick occupation based on non-financial motivation due to the absence of the societal standard will stand if the motion is opposed. And there it is more likely that the people are pressured by the narrative instead of being motivated due to the analysis and characterization of the narrative and the privilege and the inaccessibility to get success that the opening government has brought to us. The next thing we'll do is we'll consider and talk about the closing government's case. Closing government essentially brought two things. One, they told you about the glorification of career success results into an overemphasis on individual effort to reach the parameter of success. The direct outcome of this is that people will refuse to work together and instead compete with each other due to the burden of the narrative. And it also justifies structural barriers that it is an individual effort to overcome it and succeed. And the counter proposal that closing government brought is that with the absence of individualism, people will instead unionize against the capital owner and thus equalize the bargaining power when protesting against injustice. This is how we weigh the government bench. We think opening government wins against the closing government because of two reasons. Firstly, because of the contribution of the government bench was more significant in the opening government. Labor unionization from the closing government is a new analysis that has never been brought by the opening government, but it is not able to go over what the opening government has brought because one, the prerequisite of being able to prove that the unionization is beneficial is reliant on the analysis of the opening government that people are unable to access the success and therefore needs unionization. But secondly, CG mostly focuses on the counter proposal of labor unionization. But one, this cannot be weighed more than the opening government, as the analysis as to why the glorification of career success should be opposed has been established by the opening governments. CG's mechanism of unionization might or might not be a better counter proposal. Yet the reason for why opposing the motion that eventually leads to the counter proposal that CG wants is necessary was mainly using opening government's analysis, and therefore we believe that opening government's analysis was rather more important than the counter proposal given by the closing government. And secondly, CG did not mechanize or extend further regarding why individuals' inability to succeed is happening and why that happens, and therefore the credit onto the analysis of the individual's inability to succeed goes to the opening government's analysis. The second reason as to why opening government wins against the closing government is also because of the certainty of their impact. One, CG's case of the ability to change the people in power is uncertain due to two reasons. One, there's a lack of process analysis of how opposing the narrative will result into people getting unionized. So CG explained that unionization is what CG wants, but they do not explain how those unionization will happen to begin with. But secondly, there is an unproven process as well of how unionization will change the capital owner given their own analysis of privilege and unequal standing like compared to capital owner in itself. So therefore it is a bit questionable of how that unionization will create the benefit that the closing government wants to begin with. Um, but secondly, opening government's case on invalidation for most people that cannot achieve the success and agency to pick which life path is the most suitable for them is therefore more certain due to their deeper characterization on how people perceive the glorification and therefore will react in a way that limits the agency of individuals. So the weighing between an unguaranteed benefit of unionization in closing government and a proven harm that individuals are invalid and unhappy due to the narrative makes us, the core educator panels, to believe that opening government's case is able to give more certainty of impact in comparison to the closing government. Um, the next comparison is the short diagonal comparison, CG versus OO. We believe that CG wins against the opening opposition because of the manifestation of the narrative and what it entails based on the characterization of the society. CG gives a comparatively better nuance on how the narrative was constructed. It looks like the glorification of successful people and the emphasis on their individual efforts, and this strengthened the idea of the perception of competition among fellow workers and the inability to unionize against the capital owner. We think that the opening opposition was less persuasive when they only explain that people will be supportive because the narrative pushes everyone to excel without the explanation on why such characterization of society is likely. So I think both sides of the house agree that glorification will result into a standardization of the society and standardization of success, but closing government has explained better onto why the manifestation will go onto individualism, and we think that opening opposition's argument or analysis that people will perceive the glorification in a way that you want to support other people was rather assertive and not explained well as to why that is the more likely thing to happen. Um, let's now bring closing oppositions on the table. Closing opposition essentially brought two things. One, people and workers are likely to be supportive to each other because of the relatability between workers, the need to work together, and the need to have good ally in the company or team. And secondly, that the glorification will push people into pushing boundaries, which leads into innovation that uplift the civilization. Let's compare opening government to closing opposition. We think that the opening government wins against the closing opposition. Here's the problem with the closing opposition. One, there's a lack of analysis on why, with the absence of the glorification, people are unlikely to make innovation and not pushing boundaries. And also, they has have yet to explain how does the push works and why would that result in innovation. The second problem with the closing opposition is there's a lack of explicit weighing against invalidation and absence of agency that the opening government brought, and why the process of pushing boundaries does not invalidate people and thus limits their agency. Opening governments wins due to their analysis of how people would likely to react in a way that pressures and limit the choice of everyone, which means opening government wins on two things. One, they win on the magnitude of impact. OG's ability to visualize how it will impact the vast majority of society is therefore more significant in comparison to this to CO's innovation and and how that will affect the vast majority of human beings. The second reason, the second metrics that OG wins on is on the certainty of the benefit. Opening government's ability to demonstrate the likelihood of the society pressuring others to meet the glorified standards, therefore stands in comparison to the likelihood on people will push it in a positive way that results in innovation that the closing opposition brought. Um, Now let's compare closing opposition to the opening opposition. We think that closing opposition wins again the opening opposition because of the prerequisite analysis that the closing opposition brought. What are the prerequisite analysis? One, the likelihood to behave in a supportive manner. This is explained by the CO when they characterize the bonds that you make while working together. This is the prerequisite of the opening opposition's benefit of pushing these people, and therefore CO's benefit of pushing boundaries that leads to innovation can be more believed due to the CO's analysis on the characterization of how people will be more likely to be supportive. The second prerequisite that the closing opposition brought is the impact and importance of the benefit in itself. Opening opposition was rather unclear on why pushing these people forward actually matters in the society, and therefore CO fills in the gap by explaining that it is to push innovation that leads into helping the society as a whole, and therefore, the reason as to why we can believe either A, the society will react in a positive manner, and B, the push will result into a net positive benefit for the society only exists in the closing opposition, and therefore they fill in the prerequisite analysis, and therefore closing opposition wins against the opening opposition. The last comparison will be on the closing half, that is the closing up versus closing half. We give the winning to the closing opposition because of two reasons. One, the mitigation on CG's analysis on people being selfish. CO analyzes that it is unlikely for workers to be evil due to their relatability between workers, the need to work together, and the need to have good ally in the company or team. And we believe that it is sufficient to eliminate the main prerequisite of the closing government's case, and therefore CG's case falls compared to the closing opposition. But the second reason why CO wins is because of the magnitude of the impact of the innovation. CG responded to CO's innovation case by saying that it is not the individual's effort, but rather the collective effort. The problems are twofold. One, CEO's case of innovation is not reliant on it being individual versus collective, but all cases of pushing boundaries that leads to innovation is good, irrespective of it being individual or collective. But secondly, irrespective of whose effort is the innovation, this does not negate the significance of the societal benefit that that of the innovation that closing opposition has brought, and therefore the impact was more significant in the closing opposition compared to the closing government. So that's all for the decision. I'll give it to Kariel.
Hi everyone, my name is Ariel. I am part of NOVED 2023's Core Adjudication Panel, and I'm going to be bringing the last part of the judge test debrief, which is the justification for the speaker scores of the debate exhibition. So before proceeding, this part is going to be talking about general comments on the overall scoring done by all of the judges, notes on margins, and then we're going to talk about each of the individuals and comparison from each of the teams as well. But before that, this is just a general reminder of how important speaker scores are, because they are going to be metrics also used when we're making draws and matchups. This is also, deal breakers, tiebreakers for tight same VPs teams during the breaks. This will, of course, affect your speaker ranks, and this is all equally important parts within a tournament to ensure that with the teams know their performance, as this is the numerical equation of how well you did during your rounds. So because of how important this is, we want to ensure all of the judges are also able to use this last part of the debrief as a way to standardize your scoring onto individuals in a way that is up to the standard, the metric that is wildly available, but also what the CAP has already expected, because we want to ensure that the standard is as what VP judging should be like. So that's something to keep in mind as we go on to this part. So, as a refresher, these are the rankings. We're going to talk about each of the teams one by one, why certain individuals get those scores, also margins between the teams and margins between individuals within the same team. But before that, there are 4 general notes from the overall aspects of the scorings done by individuals, by the judges. The first one is that judges tend to overscore specific individuals under 2 biases that we assume are happening. First, either they are well-known individuals because there were some members of the debate exhibitions who, might have a certain reputation that precedes them. And second of all, those who maybe speak more fluently and etc. I think we want to keep in mind that these are 2 biases that should not be used as one of the parameters of judging, as already been mentioned within the judge briefing, that you should judge based on the logic and the content that's actually brought, not based on whether the fluent whether the English is fluent or the speaker uses sophisticated English, and especially not because they're well known. We see a lot of those who are well-known debaters, for an example, getting more scores than what we think should have been given onto them. So this is something to keep in mind. Ask yourself every time you're about to score whether the individual's name or whether the individual's team especially is something that makes you overscore them in a certain way. So ensure that your biases are always kept in check. The second of all thing that we want to remind is that the metric of BP scales we feel needs to be refreshed because the overall scoring from majority of judges is like 2 to 3 points over from what the CAP has expected. So it's not just overscoring to certain individuals, but the overall scoring of all the teams seems to be a little bit more than what we expect. So we want to, remind once again to ensure that you always refer to the speaking score scale. Ensure that you're not overscoring because all 80s and 80 pluses are always something that is a bit more common these days. But we want to ensure that those people who actually get 80s and above actually deserve those scores, not because you think that you would want to give a higher score and be generous with it, right? So it's always according to the scale that has been provided. The third general note is that judges should be more willing to give margins between speakers of the same team because not all teammates always bring equal contributions. Some might bring more than others. As long as you're able to justify a small margin or a big margin, we feel that it's necessary to keep in mind. But later, more on this when we're talking about per teams. And lastly, a note that we want to ensure all judges do keep in mind is that make sure you always are able to access the speaker score scale. This is something that is already available in the judge brief and you can access it later on, but we want to make sure that maybe it's something you bookmark on your tab. So every time you're about to submit your ballots, you are able to review the speaker score easily and see that if the description based on the metric is actually according to the score that you're going to give towards these individuals. Make sure that you do not rely based on your assumption or based on how much you think it will be like based on your own thinking, because in the end of the day, assumptions can get a bit more flexible the more rounds you judge. So it's important to always be refreshed and remember how the BP metrics look like. So yeah, that's on the general notes. The next part of this, talking about notes on margins. This is specifically talking between teams because there's a very tight margin that the cap gives, but there's also a really large one, and we're going to talk about why this is the case. But this is something to keep in mind, as just because a team wins or loses does not automatically mean that it's always going to be on the same level. Margins do reflect what the debate looks like. So tight margins means that it was a close one, or a wider margin means that it was a clearer win or a clear lose. So yeah, that's why margins is also something important to keep in mind when you are also submitting your ballot, especially since tap ballots also give you the benefit of automatically calculating the scores and automatically calculating the margins between the teams and individuals. So let's talk about the first one that we want to note about is regarding the margin between OG and CO. This was a very tight margin. There's only a 1 point difference between 156 and 155. We feel that, first of all, both teams had cases that went against each other, and there was now specific weighing in a way that puts one clearly above the other. So eventually the tipping point was more towards the lack of analysis, which made it, that's why it was a very tight tipping point. But second of all, this was one of the comparisons that we spent most time upon when the CAP was deliberating on the exhibition. So we feel that exactly because it was very hard to reach in a conclusion, we feel that tight margin is what exactly reflected what happened during the debate. The second noticeable thing is regarding the margin between OO, the fourth rank in the debate, compared to the rest of the teams, especially let's say OO towards CG, who got third. There's almost a 6 point margin. We feel this was necessary because in terms of contribution, OO was lacking in likelihood and especially in engagement towards the rest of the teams, while the other teams were able to somewhat engage to what OO has already brought. And this is something important because a lot of a lot of judges overcredited what OO has brought. I think in the end of the day, everyone needs to be refreshed and remember that it's the content on the logic behind the points that the teams brought, which are the ones that you should be judging upon. The last thing we want to note is about the noticeable margin between CG and CO, which is the third and second. We feel that in the closing half, their 5-point margin is something necessary because first of all, we feel that CO was able to tackle a lot of the cases coming from what CG has brought, and they were more engaging and be able to weigh it. But second of all, in the end of the closing half, there was a lot of what CO has brought that was left unresponded. So specifically on GovWeb, the margin widened a bit there because a lot of CO's case were still standing in the end of the closing half. So yeah, hopefully this gives insight generally what margins actually mean and like how then it's actually supposed to be part of your deliberation process, making sure that the margins do reflect what actually happened within the debate. So let's go to per team. We're going to discuss each of the 4 teams and why they're scored that way. In each of the team analysis, there are 4 parts that needs to be highlighted. First is regarding the scorings and the justification why we gave that score. The second underneath that you can directly compare to the scoring range explanation that we've already provided onto you. So this is going to be the direct comparison of why the score is that way, as well as on the explanation that is given within the speaker score range. So you're able to use this to standardize your own way of scoring individuals. The third on the right-hand side, the score deviation of the scores that were submitted onto us. So the line in the middle is the score that we give onto these individuals, and the blue line determines how the other scores were deviated from the score that the CAP has given to these individuals. And lastly, there are some notes that to keep in mind over the overall. Each of the teams analysis looks like this. So that's generally how to apprehend the information that is going to be shown on your screen. Let's talk about OG. So we gave OG first rank, and these are the scores that are given. Let's talk about per individual. On Prime Minister, we gave a 77 because we think that the main points coming from OG has already been asserted in PM and was able to extend to what was able to explain to what extent the glorification looked like. But the reason why it is 77, that even though it is somewhat relevant and it addresses most of the core issues, there's lots of lack of process analysis and there is a lot of deficit of explanation that makes it prone to be rebutted by OO, as according to the metric of the 76 till 78 range, is that we feel like this is something Prime Minister has done. It is definitely easy to follow. It is definitely something we're able to understand. However, there's a lot of things that need to be better elaborated, which is why it's 77 and not any higher than that. The note onto the Prime Minister is that, as you can see in the score deviation, a lot of people tend to overscore the Prime Minister and overcredit a lot of things they brought. So the reminder towards this is to ensure that you actually weigh in whether or not the points are likely and to happen and whether or not the process makes sense. And it's not just about whether or not it's right or wrong, but it's also about whether the motion is able to manifest in what has been brought by each of the speakers. Next, let's talk about Deputy Prime Minister, and we gave Deputy Prime Minister a 79. The first and the main reason is because Deputy Prime Minister was able to elaborate more on the process analysis, especially a lot of the points that were asserted in Prime Minister was better elaborated and manifested in Deputy Prime Minister. And we feel like this crystallization that brought by Deputy Prime Minister was actually one of the biggest tipping points when we're comparing OG towards the rest of the teams. Therefore, that's why we do believe that more credit to DPM is necessary in opening government. The thing about Deputy Prime Minister is, in fact, a lot of the judges undercredit Deputy Prime Minister. As you can see in the scale, there's a whole lot more of judges who score DPM under 79, and we think this is something to keep in mind, that you need to actually see how then the individual should be scored. Some notes on this is that first, the margin of 2 is necessary because as even though Prime Minister was already able to assert and claim most of the points that eventually became OG's identity, we feel that the process analysis and portrayals, that is the prerequisite to understanding what OG's world looks like, has only been established in DPM. The second thing we want to note is that neither speakers went above 80 because we saw there were a few people, albeit outliers, but still scored the speakers above 80. We do not think it's that high of a scoring, so that's why the highest score is in Deputy Prime Minister at 79. This is for OG. Next, let's talk about OO, who was ranked 4th in this debate. Per speaker first. First is leader of opposition. We are able to give leader of opposition a 67 is because there were some claims coming from leader of opposition that were to some extent able to be tied back to the motion. However, these were all just claims that the explanations have a lot of significant logical gaps. In a way, it is under elaborated and lack explanation. So it was something that is very hard to credit, and it was something that eventually was very prone to rebuttals coming from the opening government. So we feel that even though the claims were generally relevant, it is not something that we can give higher than 67 because it's so hard to buy the cases, especially since there was a lack of explanation coming from it. Yeah. So almost all the judges massively overcredited LO, and there was a lot that give LO above 70 that we did not think was a justified score to give LO, considering that a lot of the claims were very unelaborated. So please analyze as well whether or not these points, again, not only that they are right, but whether or not they're actually something that were explained other than the claims that were promised in a specific speaker. The next one we're going to talk about is Deputy Leader of Opposition, and what Deputy Leader of Opposition did to get a 77 according to the CAP is that first, they were able to patch up the claims inserted by LO in a more elaborated way. Actually, most of the cases coming from OO, most of the contributions in OO were only clear after DLO. So that's something that we want to heavily credit in DLO. These arguments coming from DLO were relevant to the motion, were something that they've ever able to explain the exclusivity of why then this becomes necessary in OO to oppose this motion and to talk about the glorification in it of itself. So we think that's why DLO deserves this kind of score. However, the reason why we're not able to give DLO higher than 77 is because there's still lacks of analysis as per the range explanation of 76 to 78 that it may slip into deficit of explanations and it seems simplistic. This is specifically highlighting in opening opposition. There is a lack of likelihood analysis, especially and charitable engagement regarding to what OG has already brought. So that's why we weren't able to give DLO a higher score than 77. Here, majority of judges also overcredited DLO. As you can see, most of the score range is way above the one that we have determined. A lot of them almost going above 80, and we think this is not a score that we would have given DLO, so that is something to keep in mind. Some notes within the opening opposition is that first, the margin is up to 10, and we feel like this margin of 10 between speakers is something justified, as even though the assertions in LO was eventually something that is extended onto DLO, as in like they were the same premise. What in LO it's something that it's very hard to buy as they were just assertions, but in DLO it's something that is fully established and fully rounded out the case coming from OO. So that's why we feel there's heavy credit coming to DLO. Second thing we want to keep a note is that, as you can see based on the graph, is that both of the speakers in OO were heavily overcredited. So we need to ensure that judges either are not the judges have to overcome their bias, or judges have to really understand what is the case brought by each of the teams, because we think that especially reading the OAs, a lot of the judges credit OO a lot, even though that's something that either was A, something not likely to explain, or B, something not as well-rounded as per the OAs given by the judges in their submissions. Next, we're going to talk about closing government, who was ranked third, and these are the scores that the CAP has agreed upon them. We're going to talk about member of government first. We gave member of government 78 because there were reframing and new extensions that were brought in. Member was well elaborated, and this becomes a majority of the tipping points when weighed with the other teams. We feel like the 78 is necessary because the arguments are very and almost exclusively relevant, because it talks about specifically about the glorification of the narrative and why then they should oppose it. It does fall into some, however, it does fall into some deficit in explanation. We think the reason we cannot put member of government above 78, we cannot give that because there is a lack of likelihood of why then the union is something people will opt to, and that eventually becomes one of our bigger tipping points of why we cannot give CG above the other two teams in first and second, is because there is this lack of process. That's why even though it was clear to follow and it is something that we can credit, it cannot be above 78 because we think that this lack of analysis becomes one of the things that's hard to credit in closing government. Member of government has one of the most accurate scorings by majority of judges compared to the other speakers. As you can see, most of these people gave 78, so I think this is a good way to standardize. But there's still a few outliers under crediting member of gov, and there's a few also heavily over crediting member of gov. So please keep in mind about this. Next is government whip, and we gave government whip a 72 because the contributions and the explanations were mostly relevant. However, two reasons why we're not able to give government whip above 72 is because there lacks of analysis, and most of the time it's quite hard to follow the points that they were trying to elaborate. But the second thing, and most importantly, is the engagements in the case, basically the contribution from government whip in the form of rebuttals, in the form of glorifying what CG was bringing, is something that is quite similar to what member of government has already said. So we think that it's not something that should be credited to government whip, hence the 72. And if there's any things that was highlighted in government whip, it should not be credited to them, but into member of gov in the end of the day. Almost all judges overcredited government whip. Only a few was on point or even lower, but we think the scale on the graph, the second graph, shows that government whip was heavily overcredited. So this is something to keep in mind once again, whether or not the explanations coming from the same team is something that is also repetitive of the previous speaker or not, because that does affect their speaker scores. The note for closing government is that there's quite a huge margin between speakers, which is about 6 points. It's exactly 6 points. That is a reflection to the contribution brought by CG, which was mainly brought in member of government. This is something we feel is a justified margin because, again, most of the things were brought from member of government. If there were any additions or extra analysis coming from government whip or any new rebuttals, we feel they were marginal at best, and it's not something that we're able to say is completely new engagement coming from government whip. Okay, the last team, but definitely not the least team in the debate, is closing opposition, who got second in this debate. And these were the scores that the CAP has agreed upon to them. So member of opposition, we gave a 75, which is, pretty the average or like the standard score, because we feel that member of opposition's contribution was clear to understand. They were able to set up in what does CO's world look like and what does its identity look like. But the reason why it's 75 and not any higher, that even though it is relevant, it still lacks quite a few core issues, specifically on being able to elaborate more on these points that were brought in member of opposition, and that there were a lack of engagements towards closing government. Almost all of the judges over-credited member of opposition, as you can see in the scale. Only a few of them actually gave 75 and mostly gave above 75. So I think, yeah, keep in mind generally as per the previous reminders as well. But as you can see by now, as this is the fourth comparison, the fourth theme that we're talking about, a lot of the scorings are massively overcredited. So check again with yourself. Is this the right score, or do you need to reduce it a bit? Read the scale once again, because there might be a range of 73 to 75 for an example, but 1 point does make a huge difference between speakers. Next is regarding opposition whip. Opposition whip, we were able to give 80 because we feel that opposition whip's speech overall had a lot of really strong rebuttals and engagements, especially towards the other three teams. This ultimately also became the tipping points in which why opposition whip speech eventually became a lot of the tipping points to compare CO towards the other team. So we feel like there's a huge credit going to opposition whip, but especially that the extension of MO's case and CO's case overall was crystallized in coming in opposition whip. So we feel like this was a necessary score to give opposition whip, as they were able to make a lot of points without any obvious logical gaps, and it's something that has been well explained. The thing about opposition whip is that a lot of judges slightly undercredit opposition whip, despite not being that much. We do think that, again, one score does make a difference, and most of there were very little judges who actually gave opposition whip an 80. So this is something to keep in mind. The note on this on closing opposition is that there is a 5-point margin. We think is necessary to reflect the contribution brought by CO, which was mainly done by which was mainly done by opposition whip. Okay, we're gonna change the proper later. But it was mainly done by opposition whip. So the margin of 5 that puts opposition whip at 80 and member of opposition at 75 is something necessary to do. Yeah, so that is all for the speaker score debrief, and since I'm also the last part of the overall video explanation of debrief, we hope that if you're already into this part, we hope that you genuinely listen to everything, even though albeit it is it's a very long explanation. We feel it is still necessary because we do hope going into NOVED, you are not only judging for the sake of it, but you do refresh yourself as what a standard of BP judging looks like, because it's also such a big scale and such a classic tournament. We do hope that all of the judges here are remembered once again what judging is supposed to look like. But at the same time, you're also able to get insight. So moving forward from NOVED, you're also able to become a much better judge. So yeah, on behalf of the CAP, thank you so much for watching this, and we'll see you guys during the tournament. Bye bye.